It's February, the wet season, and Malcolm Douglas sets off on another adventure. Towing his boat right across Australia, heading for the wilds of the northwest Kimberley.
After a hard 7 days drive from Sydney, I finally reached Wyndham, the back end of Australia at the bottom of Cambridge Gulf. Got a mate of mine, Brett Nixon, just flown over from Kimberley Cattle Station. He's going to accompany me on this journey. We're going to put the boat in here at Wyndham, sail right up Cambridge Gulf, the Mitchell Plateau, right round the far northwest of Australia. In about 2 months' time, we're going to pull the boat out of Derby. I'm very excited about this trip because in my 25 years travelling, I've never yet been able to get up this eastern side of the Kimberley. So all we have to do now is put the boat in and get going.
The boat's been specially constructed to carry 600 litres of fuel, but another 200-litre drums been added, making a total of 800 litres, needed for the first leg of the journey. All supplies and last-minute items must be purchased here in Wyndham, for it's the only town on the coast until journey's end at Derby. In the early morning, with the boat heavily laden, Malcolm and Brett motor past the Wyndham jetty to begin the long journey up the muddy Cambridge Gulf. They're heading into one of the loneliest parts of Australia. Malcolm's wanted to explore this part of the coast for many years. For Malcolm's dog Jowdy, it's just another trip. Near the mouth of the Ord River, their journey is interrupted. The boat's marooned by the dropping tide on a huge mudbank. In the 40-degree heat, a long trench for the boat's keel is gouged out towards deeper water. If it doesn't float on the next high tide, they'll be stuck for a week until the tides build again. Around midnight, water covers the mudbank. The boat's pushed free and they steer slowly towards deeper water. With all settlements left far behind now, a close weather watch must be maintained, for this is the season of cyclones. Malcolm and Brett head for the first big river on this section of the coast.
We're 100 nautical miles north from Wyndham. We're just about to enter the mouth of the Berkeley River. Down at the mouth here, fairly typical river with low sand dunes and mangroves on each side. But as it flows inland, it enters some of the most spectacular gorge country in the whole of Australia. We're just going to boil a billy and go and have a look at it.
The sand dunes and mangroves soon give way to magnificent cliffs, rising higher and higher as they run inland. A small creek leads them into a beautiful gorge, and the first of many waterfalls that the travellers will see as the weeks pass.
Well, this is what these trips are all about. We've battled up the coast 100 miles from Wyndham, but it's all worthwhile when you come to something like this.
A huge natural amphitheatre, its serenity disturbed only by the splash of water cascading from the rim. The cool, deep shadows are a respite from the intense heat. Malcolm drags his lunch over the rocks to cook it on an open fire. Fresh barramundi. And plenty of it. Late in the afternoon, they motor further up the chasm and anchor for the night in a small bay carved from the cliffs by countless wet seasons. With a casual flick of the wrist, Brett catches his breakfast at the back of the boat. A good-sized mullet. The men motor upriver, following the spectacular line of cliffs to the limit of tidal influence, looking for a likely spot to fish for the mighty barramundi.
When I'm in the cities, one of the questions that I'm asked most is, where you catch big barramundi? Well, that's a secret. But I can tell you that this river is a perfect barra river. You've got the salt water and the freshwater meeting. I've got a rising tide. I've got storms building in the background, up in the headwaters. It's very hot, it's very humid. This is a perfect time to get a barra. So let's see if we can catch one. All I have to do is drop the lure into the deep water and just work the lure around the rocks. How's that for a fish? It's about 15 kilos. Beautiful specimen. The reason I caught that fish so quickly is because we're in such an isolated place. It's too big to eat, just for Brett and I. So we'll get him back in the water. He looks knocked up, but I tell you what, give him a couple of seconds and he'll swim away.
Malcolm fishes the dropping tide for the sheer thrill of it, hoping to land something a little smaller.
And there's our tea. What a magnificent looking fish. Not only are they a beautiful looking fish, they're also a gourmet meal. And this one won't be going back into the water, this one's going into the frying pan.
A wet season storm lashes the high country. As the rains clear, the men return to their deep water anchorage to find that the gentle falls of the day before have been transformed into a seemingly solid column of white water. The fickle weather creates many moods, from dazzling sunlight to misty overcast. The soft pastels of the morning light paint a dramatic picture as Brett cooks the breakfast damper. After a week in the gorge, they head back to the open sea. Along the way, a detour up a creek ends abruptly at an amazing cascade. An arduous climb rewards the men with a distant view over the stony country, out over the plateau, and the waterfall tumbling in tears to the river below. Their descent attracts a crocodile, curious at the intrusion into its territory. In the lull between the storms, the sea is mirror calm, and it's a pleasure motoring along the coast. At times, the rocky cliffs come close to the coast, creating some of the most scenic beaches in Australia. Everywhere there are fish, especially schools of mullet. And these provide the men's staple diet. Once a day, the nets run out, and within minutes, fresh fish. Any fish not wanted must be released quickly. Malcolm has some trouble with a small shark. It just won't go away until Jardy lends a hand. As fuel is used up and the boat gets lighter, propellers are changed to give maximum economy. Stainless steel props are always fitted. They don't snap on contact with submerged reefs. At the entrance to the King George River, the boat motors through eroded cliffs. A massive buttress blocks the waterway.
We've left the Berkeley River far to the south. We've motored up the coast, and now we've come right to the top of the next main river, the King George River. This is truly remarkable country. You know, it's almost 200 years since Europeans first arrived in Australia. And this country is still unknown to the majority of Australians. I just hope in a few years this whole northwest area will be classified as a huge national park, because this area would have to have some of the most spectacular and awe-inspiring scenery in the whole of Australia. Just have a look at this. Isn't that fantastic? What Brett and I are going to do now is anchor the boat. We're going to walk right to the top of the gorge and hike around so we can have a look at the falls from behind. Just before we go, I noticed with the tide dropping, the biggest oysters I've ever seen in my life starting to appear on the rocks here. I think Brett and I, we better have a good feed of these giant oysters before we head off up the top of the cliff.
Conditions here must be perfect for oysters. Nowhere has Malcolm seen such large ones. Abundant and so easy to collect. Barbecued for a few seconds, and with the luxury of bottled lemon juice, they're delicious. The oppressive heat and high humidity plague the men on the long climb up the cliff. But at the top, it's all worthwhile, for the view is absolutely breathtaking. Far below, the boat is reduced to a mere dot. Leaving the first falls, the men hike around to the second drop. There are some anxious moments keeping the camera above water in the flood. Finally, the awe-inspiring view from the precipice. The sheer magnitude of the falls dwarfs the boat in the foreground. After the spectacular King George River, it's a long run around Cape Londonderry, then westward along the top of Australia's northwest coast. Quite suddenly, an animal surfaces near the boat. It's a dugong, a shy marine mammal, rarely seen at such close range. Ecological changes, pollution, development, and hunting are threatening the existence of these inoffensive mammals throughout the world. To many people, including the Aborigines, dugong meat is a delicacy. But the Aborigines have long since left this remote coastline, and today the dugong live undisturbed. Dugong are also called sea cows because they feed on marine grasses. Folklore attributes the mermaid legend to the dugong. With the winds rising, they anchor behind a small sandy cay. The water teems with schools of whiting, and little effort bags a delicious meal.
It's a waiting game here. We're waiting for the tide to come in and these strong winds to stop. We're anchored in shallow water behind a little sandy island about 2 kilometres off the coast. And just out in front of me is a giant saltwater croc waiting for me or Brett or Jowdy to go down into the water. Just goes to show how alert you've got to be up here all the time. Most people assume that saltwater crocs are only found over in the mangroves and the muddy rivers. Well, that's quite wrong, because this is a classic example. The tide is just starting to come in, and this croc is just down there in front of me now.
On the rising tide, the crocodile retreats slightly and floats like a log out from the boat. Jowdy, unaware of the danger, watches small fish, her favourite pastime. The croc begins to move in, only the slightest ripple suggesting its approach. A warning from Malcolm, and she immediately leaves the water. The strange shape only increases her curiosity. Any closer, and the croc will attack, rushing forward with lightning speed. A final command, and Jowdy moves to safety. The big croc lurks close by until they leave. The next stop is a small bay on the mainland on one of the loneliest stretches of the Australian coast. During the Second World War, it was a bustle of activity when the Allies landed supplies here for the Truscott Air Base. Today, there's little to see, except a few relics, like this framework for a shower, a bed frame, and piles of drums.
These are the last of the drums left after the war. Been here for, what, over 40 years now. The heavy galvanised ones are still all right. The lighter ones, of course, are just about disintegrated. This is interesting, where this tree growing out of the top of this drum, and it's brought its root right out of the drum, right over the side, gone down into the ground, down the side of the drum there. Not a good place to camp because all these drums are full of water. There's thousands of mosquito larvae in all of these drums. What we have to do now is just wait for the high tide. We can head for Trouton Island. One thing about this country, you give the old Aussie salute to the men of Truscott, getting rid of these flies all the time because they're really, really bad. Come on, buzz off. Righto, let's get this gear packed up and get out of here.
Heading due north, they make for a tiny speck in the Timor Sea. Here they are to pick up their next 800 litres of fuel.
We're now on Trouton Island. This is where the men fly in by plane from Darwin and go by helicopter out to the Jabiru oil wells. This is a big new discovery off the northwest of Australia. It's basically run by BHP Petroleum. And with their cooperation, we're going to use a big Bell helicopter behind me, fly over to the mainland and have a look at the Mitchell Falls. We're not able to reach these falls by boat. Then we're going to fly along the coast and hopefully spot some of the planes that went down during the war.
Within 20 minutes, they're over the mainland, following the course of the Mitchell River. It flows through low, flat mangrove plains that soon give way to stony escarpment country. Minutes later, they're over the Mitchell Plateau, an area where huge deposits of bauxite have been discovered. In a good wet season, after cyclonic rains, the Mitchell Falls are raging torrents. This year, with only sporadic rain during a late build-up to the monsoons, the falls, although not at their peak, present a dazzling display. Leaving the falls, they fly back east along the coast towards Truscott, the wartime airfield. Not far from the strip, near the coast, they spot the wreckage of a plane. After pinpointing the wreck, they swing inland and locate the old service road from the coast. This leads to the overgrown runway. The bombers from this airstrip played a major part in defeating the Japanese in the Second World War. With the boat refueled, Malcolm and Brett head back to the mainland and anchor near the location of the plane wreck they spotted 2 days earlier. Walking inland, they soon come across this grim reminder of the conflict. This United States Army DC-3 crashed only minutes from the Truscott runway. Cut in half by a salvage crew retrieving its cargo, it still lies largely intact in the encroaching scrub, 40 years later. With storms all around, the air is unbelievably hot and the sticky humidity unbearable. The men wait for the tide to refloat their vessel, lazing in the only decent shade around. And now they put in several days constant travelling while the weather is calm. Without protection, the intense glare would quickly blister Malcolm's face. This wild, rugged coast is full of surprises. While motoring towards the Hunter River, the men come upon a spring, gushing high in the rock face.
This is what's so special about this northwest coast. We've just come into a bay. It will be as hot and as dry and as barren as you can imagine. Come around the first corner and this is what we find. It really is a magic place.
Motoring on, they pass the distinctive Sphinx-like landmarks at the entrance to the Hunter River. The Hunter River is lined with a thick wall of mangroves. A young saltwater crocodile floats camouflaged in the shadows. With a salt and freshwater meat, the men anchor and go ashore for lunch. Within minutes, the tide drops and the boat keels over at a precarious angle on the rocks. The men work quickly, roping the boat to the mangroves to prevent its rolling further. If it jammed at this angle, the next rising tide would sink it within minutes. Brett works quickly, saving some of the precious fuel that's flowing from the air bungs. There's nothing that the men can do now but wait 12 hours for the turn of the tide. Malcolm heads inland to a place where the map pinpoints unusual rock formations. And he's not disappointed. Within the hour, he stands in a huge basin, ringed at the base with lush tropical rainforest. The distant roar of water urges Malcolm on, and at the end of the chasm, he discovers yet another majestic waterfall. Without a doubt, this wild northwest coast must have some of the most remarkable scenery in Australia. By sundown, he's back at the boat, and there's the long, anxious wait until the tide rises at midnight. All ends well, and the next day they head back out of the Hunter to explore some of the other nearby rivers. Malcolm spots wild cattle ahead, and hungry for red meat, he's quickly ashore. In the next few years, the government's planning to use helicopters to shoot all the wild cattle in the north. They're a health risk to station-bred stock. With only a few minutes to get the meat before the change of tide, Brett hurriedly cuts out the fillet. Wraps it in green hide. And to be sure they'll have a good supply, takes a leg. Malcolm only shot the feral cow because it's already marked for eradication. Having grown up on a cattle station, Brett's favourite meal is beef. He skillfully bones out the meat and hangs it to cool. Back out at sea, the Coast Watch plane sweeps low. They patrol regularly, looking for unauthorised craft and always monitor Malcolm's position. Ahead lies a sandy beach, where Malcolm hopes to locate a historic marker. The men head towards a jungle thicket on the edge of the timberline. Here they find an ancient boab tree.
These boab trees would have to be one of the most extraordinary trees in Australia. With this grotesque shape and this huge trunk. But this one is particularly significant because of this graffiti carved on here. In 1820, Lieutenant Philip Arthur King and his crew were on the sloop, the Mermaid, exploring and discovering this northwest coast of Australia. They careened the Mermaid in this little bay just in front of me, and is now marked on maps as Careening Bay. While they're checking the boat, some of the crew have come up here and they've carved this extraordinary graffiti in the tree. So we now have HMC MERMAID, Mermaid, and down the bottom, 1820. So on this lonely coast of Australia, we now have this little bit of Australian history.
These extraordinary trees grow all along the coast. During the wet season, they're covered in dense foliage. But with the end of the rains, they lose their leaves to conserve moisture during the long dry. These two, almost at the water's edge, are bonsai'd specimens. Obviously very old, but no taller than Malcolm. In the morning, the travellers head for the mighty Prince Regent River to visit the enchanting King's Cascades. Named after Philip Parker King, they were discovered when his crew rowed up the river looking for fresh water. These splendid falls run all the year, but at this time, they are truly spectacular. Although much of the northwest is harsh and barren, there are isolated pockets of rainforest. Near the Cascades is the lush splendour of masses of Kimberley fern. This glorious specimen has been only recently introduced as a popular indoor plant throughout Australia. Out on the open mud flats, Malcolm spots what he thinks is a mud crab and investigates. But it's a newly hatched crocodile. Malcolm, with his great interest in reptiles, checks it carefully before releasing it. This handful, only weeks old, could live for 80 years and grow to a length of over 6 metres. Crocodiles have extra eyelids for visibility underwater. Leaving the Cascades, they head back down the river into St George Basin. In the distance, Mount Trafalgar and Mount Waterloo, named after the famous battles. As the basin narrows again between the islands, the men have some anxious moments in the tidal turbulence. These dangerous eddies are a common occurrence as the huge rise and fall of the tide churns the water in whirlpools. Malcolm's now back in familiar waters and heads towards some low islands off the coast to do a spot of fishing. In the intense heat, cormorants pant to cool down. While in the mangroves, a young turtle browses lazily. An osprey. These regal birds, so rare in many parts of the world, are often seen on this remote coast. In the cleaner water away from the land, big trevally are always biting. This one, too big to eat, is quickly released. There's always plenty more. At the entrance to Secure Bay, the massive rush of the tide will in the future be used to generate electricity. Malcolm and Brett venture through the narrow gap and skillfully negotiate the whirlpools continuously building and disappearing. Inside the bay are strange hills of stark rock, dark and sombre. Quite different from the vivid colours of the cliffs of the coast. It's amphibolite, formed deep beneath the ocean, and during times of geological upheaval has been pushed to the surface. Pushing back out of the bay, the powerful outboard motor really works against the tidal current. At the southern end of Coolen Island lies a natural wonder that few people have seen. Usually concealed beneath metres of water, vast expanses of brain coral are exposed for only a few minutes at dead low tide. On the ebb tide, the water is clear and the abundant marine life is briefly visible. Then, within minutes, the rising tide surges over the reef. The following day, they visit another exciting natural wonder off the coast, a tidal waterfall that appears twice a day when the sea drops 10 metres off the reef in just a few hours. The water spills off the rim of this vast underwater plateau, creating a ring of sparkling cascades. This whole coast is still so remote that few people know of these amazing scenes. The ecology of this unique region presents a fascinating field of study. Below the tidal waterfalls grow strange corals and grasses that attract the dugongs and turtles. At the top of King Sound, the full intensity of the Kimberley tide is dramatically demonstrated, surging around Pelican Rock. Because of this huge and dangerous tide and the uncharted reefs, few yachts and larger boats visit the area. Good local knowledge is essential. Only a short distance away, a stunning phenomenon. As the tide drops, a curious apparition appears like a deep-sea monster. It is, in fact, the enormous force of the current rushing past a submerged rock. Finally, the long run down King Sound and into the muddy waters of the estuary. Towards the end of their journey, the radio warns of an approaching cyclone, so the men are relieved when the boat swings into the landing at Derby Wharf.
Well, here we are at Derby at last. It's quite a trip. And as usual, we're stuck in the mud. It's wait a while country, always waiting for the tide to come in or the tide to go out. Brett will have to stay with the boat now. I'm just about to grab my swag and bag, go to the airport, catch the plane to Kununurra, pick up the vehicle and trailer. In 2 days we'll be back here, and 8 days from now, back to Sydney.